today in the Gospel of John is placed in a very interesting spot. It's kind of a commissioning story up here that happens after Jesus' death and resurrection. Throughout the Gospels, the disciples are usually commissioned and called into ministry at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, but not for Peter in the Gospel of John. While it might seem confusing where in John's Gospel the scripture takes place, its placement does make sense. Peter has been through a lot. By the time the events in our scripture take place, Peter is a much different person at the end of John's Gospel than when we were first introduced to him. So maybe instead of our scripture being a commissioning story, it's more of a re-commissioning story for Peter because he is different than he was when he was first called by God. But let's back up a little bit. In John's Gospel, in order to give us a better perspective on just how much Peter changed. Just before Jesus was put on trial and crucified, he was telling his disciples about his end and what it would look like, but Peter didn't like what he heard. So he told Jesus, you know what, surely what he just said about his end will not really happen. And it was in the act that Peter declared his love for Jesus because he did not want to see his friend go through so much pain. But there's more to Peter's story than just that act of faith. Now, after Jesus was arrested, disciples were frantic about what to do next. Their leader is gone. And Peter is confronted and questioned about his relationship with Jesus. And in an interesting turn of events, Peter denies Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. For Peter to deny knowing Jesus was pretty bad. But what was worse was that Peter had 2 other chances to get it right, but he failed to do so. Peter denied knowing Jesus again and again. Now let's fast forward a little bit. After Jesus was beaten and crucified, imagine just how bad Peter must have felt. Peter's last act of devotion, or lack thereof, towards Jesus was one of denial. He failed to acknowledge Jesus. The same Jesus he was a disciple of, the same Jesus whom he traveled with and who he washed and performed miracles, the same Jesus who was his friend. And on top of reacting to the dramatic events that led to Jesus' death, the guilt that Peter had knowing he had denied knowing Christ must have been a great burden for him. Eventually, Peter receives word that Jesus' tomb, where Jesus' body should have been, was empty. So he takes a look inside the tomb himself, and it is indeed empty. But instead of jumping for joy, Peter runs back home. He runs away. Now, Peter might have been excited to know that his friend was alive, different but alive. But I also bet in that moment, Peter experienced a whole other level of grief and of pondering the question of, what have I done? It was one thing for Jesus to be dead, but now Jesus was alive. And Peter had to come face to face with the one he betrayed. What we have in our scripture is the awkward and profound exchange that Jesus and Peter had to have in order to resolve the unfortunate situation Peter got himself in. This face-to-face encounter with Peter and Jesus needed to happen in order to bring healing and reconciliation to their relationship. The events in our scripture occur right after breakfast, and Jesus asked Peter a question 3 times. Now, there are slight nuances in the question that Jesus asked Peter, But it basically boils down to this. Simon, do you love me? And Peter responds to Jesus' question 3 times. Now there are slight nuances in Peter's answer, but basically it boils down to this. Lord, you know I love you. Now let's take a time out. Does Jesus really know that Peter loves him? After all, Peter betrayed Jesus by denying his relationship with him not once, not twice, but 3 times. If someone so very close to you denied ever knowing you, you would be right to question if they actually did love you, wouldn't you? But despite all that Peter had done to Jesus, did Jesus really question Peter's love for him? Did Jesus really have doubts about Peter's love? No, I don't think so. For a second, I don't think so. But I strongly believe that Jesus asked Peter that question and asked it of him 3 times in order to reconcile Peter back to him and to mend their relationship, to redeem Peter of his past failures. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and this was Peter's chance to affirm his love for Jesus 3 times, thus canceling the wrong Peter did and making it right. And Jesus, he has a way of doing that, doesn't he? Making right that which is wrong. The exchange between Peter and Jesus was exactly what Peter needed. Peter might have wanted to avoid that uncomfortable situation, but Peter needed it, even if he didn't know it. In that moment, Jesus forgave Peter and drew him back into the fold. And not only that, but Jesus was giving Peter another opportunity to participate in meaningful work. It wasn't enough that Peter said he loved Jesus, but he needed to show it. Peter needed to do some form of action in order to cement his love for Jesus. Notice Jesus' response after Peter's statements is not something along the lines of, "Good, Peter, I'm glad that you love me. You've answered and believed correctly." Instead, Jesus' response to Peter's declaration of love is a request of action. Feed my sheep. It's because Peter loves Jesus that he is to show it by feeding God's sheep, caring for God's people the way that Jesus did. I know I mentioned it previously in sermons, maybe in just casual conversation. I think one of the biggest cracks in American Christianity is overemphasis on having the right belief. Yes, as Christians, having beliefs that are in line with God revealed through Jesus is so very important because those beliefs are foundational in life. But to believe in or to have faith in something is not good enough. We're not to leave it just at that. Jesus beckons more out of us than just belief. Jesus desires holy action. And that's a real tough part when it comes to being a disciple of Christ. Actually, being a disciple of Christ is the hardest part. It's safer to live in a state of belief than in a movement of holy action because there's a greater risk of failure. And Peter knew that firsthand. But here's some of the best good news that I think comes out of Jesus' mission and ministry. When we seek to follow Christ, to feed his sheep, we'll fail, and it's okay. And there will be times when we will fail so miserably that we will want to cave in and give up because it hurts so much, and we become so discouraged and embarrassed. But Jesus beckons us to not give up,